Norman Jay describes him as the David Attenborough of disco. It doesn't get any better than that. Yeah, and then I'll open it up to the floor for anyone who wants to ask a few questions. So, yeah, how did the book come together? Greg's done a book, Discotheque Archives, and yeah, how did it come about?
Well, I mean, it was originally a series for DJ Magazine, and they wanted me to do something of a historical nature, looking at dance culture from the past and everything. And so basically what happened was that I decided that rather than it being one subject over 2 pages, that we basically split it into 4 sections, which were classic club, classic DJ, classic record and classic label. And I had a limitation on words on each, and it just about fit into a page, you know, like when we came to wanting to do it as a book. And during lockdown, I think I'm getting a bit of feedback here. Hello? Yeah. When we were in lockdown, we decided to issue it as a limited edition paperback, and I kind of informed everybody via my social media. I was hoping that it'd sell at least 300. If it sold 500, I would have been absolutely delighted. And when the orders came in, it was just clear we ended up capping it at like 1,600 copies. And so basically, that was the run, that was the limited edition. We didn't want to go much further than that, or it wouldn't have been very limited. But it also kind of, at that point, enabled me to think about the next stage with it, of lengthening it, bringing in new subjects, and also putting it out as a hardback. And that's what we did. So we put it out at the beginning of this year as a hardback with 20 extra sections. So basically, it breaks down as there's 30 classic DJs, 30 classic venues, 30 classic labels, and 30 classic records. And it spans, obviously it covers a lot of the New York dance culture that people like Tim Lawrence has talked about in his books so brilliantly. But it also, a lot of UK culture and a lot of nooks and crannies that haven't really been properly brought to light down the years, that have been forgotten, within the documentation of dance culture. And so it's been really nice to do that.
I was going to say, it is there's so much detail in it, and I read a lot about this stuff, and I learn a lot. And how much of it did you have to research, and how much did you actually know about? Because there's so much information.
Well, I mean, obviously I kind of knew about, the majority of this stuff. There was things that were like grey areas for me, which, I learned about through people like Tim Lawrence, writing about the New York downtown scene, and DJs like Anita Sarko, Danceteria, which fascinated me because this links into the Haçienda with Danceteria and everything. So I kind of understand that scene a lot more through the process. Obviously, a lot of research and cross-referencing to be done. You can't trust, certainly online sources, that you've got to try to at least cross-reference and what you're doing, and then go back into books, for the reference. Go old school and actually look into books that have been written and find the references there. So, it's a task in itself. I mean, the main task, though, was getting it into that 440-word format, pulling it down into that without losing any of the meat, and I'm really happy with the way that turned out. There's nothing where I think, I had to leave loads out. It's one of those things anyway that you're invited to dip into it. It's not a chronological read. It's not something from, front to back. You can go anywhere. It's random. I'm not kind of placing everything in the order that it happened. So I would hope that people pick up on a subject and then maybe go online and find out more about the artist or the record or whatever, or that it spurs their imagination to move further with it. So it's in bite-sized chunks, it's also, I wanted it to be a fun read as opposed to a kind of history lesson as such, and the illustrations play into that. Pete Fowler's illustrations of the DJs bring real colour and vibrancy to the book, which I wanted. I didn't want it to be this black and white history lesson and this old thing. I wanted to try and bring it alive, so people reading it, you know, obviously there were people there and experienced these scenes, but younger people who weren't about, to capture that kind of vibrancy of what was actually going on back then, dating back into the 60s. And all this stuff that I'm writing about is what I call pre-rave, so it goes up to the mid-80s, because after that there's been so much documentation of house music and everything that's come from there. So there's all sorts of stuff that you can read on that level. But sometimes they missed the period that came before, that for me is the crucial period in dance culture in this country, because I was talking to Hewan before about it, and the early 80s period, we called it electro-funk, especially 82 and 83. And you know, that was the pivot point between what had gone before and what came after. So if you look at it, before you've got jazz funk, the jazz funk scene was the predecessor to electro funk coming and becoming the dominant force. Although all these musics were still played next to each other, it wasn't like everything was separated like they became later on. So before that, you've got like jazz funk, soul, funk, disco. And they were the scenes that were about previous. And then after, you've got hip-hop, house, and techno. So it basically, it was the catalyst that allowed one thing to become the other. And it was a very black-led scene, you know, in places like Manchester and Birmingham and Nottingham, you know, Leeds, these kind of places, Sheffield, that it was an underground scene. It was connected by all dayers, which meant that DJs from different cities would come together on a Sunday or a bank holiday Monday into one venue, and it went on from 2 o'clock until midnight. And you know, Hewan was a part of the all dayers scene, as I was.
Can I bring Hewan in here? So where did you two guys? What does your two's history go back to?
I can't remember when I first met Greg.
It must have been all dayers.
Wigan Pier.
Possibly.
Might have been Wigan Pier.
Yeah.
I got pulled into the soul scene by DJs like Colleen Curtis and Mike Schaff. I used to do the warm-up for them, and I think the first place I met you was Wigan Pier when we used to do a night there. I can't remember what night it was.
Yeah, Tuesday.
Yeah.
Because, I mean, Hewan was on the same all-dayer bills that I played on.
Yeah.
So it was, in a way, it was a little bit of a surprise when I heard you were at the Haçienda, which at that point, it's this new club that had opened. It was a world apart from what we were doing at... I mean, if you could just bring the microphone down a bit, it's yeah, I'll shout it out a bit more if possible. It's just feeding back a bit from here. Yeah. So what was I saying? The Haçienda, yeah. So when it opened, it was very different to what we were about, a legend on a Wednesday, which was a predominantly black audience, latest music coming out of New York. Now, Haçienda was owned by Factory Records, and Factory was like raincoated students and, you know, like indie kids that were into Factory. So when they opened and they took Hewan on, I mean, he'll be able to tell you this better than me, they kind of give him a square peg in a round hole situation, that they wanted him to play dance music, but the audience that was in there was not a dance audience. And so that's what he had to encounter. My own experience of it later, we were talking about this before, was the DJ booth was so badly positioned in the Haçienda when Hewan was there, and unfortunately for me, during the period that I was there, it was down the side of the stage. You came down some stairs, so you were looking out through a slit where you could maybe see people's legs if there were people in there in the first place, because it struggled to kind of pull people in. And the mixer was up here, the DJ mixer, so it was crazy, you know, and it was so different for me because Legend was so well set up for DJs, and I was known then as a mixing DJ, this newfangled mixing, which had been going on in the States for a while, but really only took on here in the early 80s. And so the Haçienda was a struggle in that sense, and the positioning of the DJ, not to mention the acoustics of the room, which were never solved properly, well, never solved, you know.
No, I remember the opening night of the Haçienda. It was amazing. They were still painting the walls and everything. The walls were still wet, and people were queuing up outside. And I remember there was a massive ladder that was in the middle of the dance floor because there was a bit of the ceiling that somebody had not painted. So people were queuing up, getting ready to come in, and someone was painting this bit, and then the ladder disappeared. And then they played a classical music track. I don't know what it was, Brahms or something like that. And it was beautiful because it filled the whole of the space. They had the sound. This was the first test of the sound system. It filled the whole place. It was absolutely gorgeous, all those choral notes and stuff. And yeah, the sound system's working fine. So Tony Wilson went on stage, gave a little speech. He got heckled. He always used to get heckled. That heckling is actually on Facebook. No, it's on YouTube. And then Tony Wilson said, "Ewan, play the music." I have no idea what my first track was. I had no idea. If I knew that the Haçienda was going to be so famous, I would have documented every single second of it. But I didn't know. And I played something that had a kick drum in it. And that kick drum just started bouncing off the bare walls and everything. And it was then that we realised that, you know, there was a problem with the sound system. And I had to live with that, you know, for the time that I was there. I remember people coming in, acoustic engineers firing. They had these little speakers on the floor, and they'd fire a burst of sound up, and then they'd measure it and put some paddings up and something like that. But that never happened. You know what I mean? It was very frustrating. And I mean, I wrote, what was his name? Ginger, the manager.
Howard Jones.
Howard Jones, who was the manager at the time. I wrote him a note saying we need some more bass bins. And he actually kept that, and that ended up in a book about the Haçienda, actually. We got the bass bin, but it still didn't work. The acoustic and the bare walls, it just didn't work at all. And then I remember one time they had an all-dayer in there, a Northern Soul all-dayer, and Richard Serling was playing, Colleen Curtis was playing, Ian Levine, and some of Pete Hagen, some of the really big Northern Soul DJs, and they all came up, and it bombed. It didn't work. It was packed, but nobody danced because they had a glass skylight, and it was daylight, and the club was just flooded with daylight, and nobody wanted to dance. Nobody had thought of putting a black tarpaulin over the window, you know, to darken it and stuff like that. It was an interesting place. I loved it. I loved Tony Wilson. You know, I loved all the people that worked in there. I was living in the Crescents at the time when I got the job, and a lot of the people who lived in the Crescent ended up working in the Haçienda anyway, so they were all people that I knew. How I got the job at the Haçienda, there was a club further downtown called Rufus, and I knew the manager of Rufus. And I used to hang around with a group of guys that eventually became the Jazz Defectors. And I love jazz, and I love dancing to jazz. I was one of them that used to fling myself all over the floor and dancing and stuff like that. I really like dancing to jazz. So we were doing a Friday night in there where we just used to go in and practice all our moves so that when we got out to Legends or somewhere like that, we could show it off in the middle of the floor and stuff like that. And in the corner of the room, there was a group of guys, and they had a funny aroma about them. They used to smoke these little things that don't know what they were. Well, I do now. They ended up being what we know of as Kalima in a certain ratio. You know, Martin Mockroff and Jez and Anne Quigley and all those people. They were sat in the corner smoking these little roll-ups, and every now and again they'd come over, "Oh, what's this track here?" "Oh, it's an Airto Mayera track." "Oh, really, really nice." And then they said, "We're going on a tour of campuses soon. Would you come and support us as the DJ? And I'm like, yeah, I've never done anything like that. It was really, really good. And we travelled between the campuses in one of those iconic Citroen cars, you know, the ones that bounces up and down. And the driver used to drive with the back of his hand like that while he was building a spliff. That turned out to be Tony Wilson. So Tony Wilson was their manager and the band manager. And I just played jazz for like an hour, and then they came on, and it kind of worked. And I had a conversation with Tony Wilson. He asked me who my favourite DJ was, and it was Frankie Crocker, who used to work at the... Yeah, he used to work at WBLS
in New York.
WBLS. And he said, oh, Frankie Crocker, that's my favourite DJ as well. I want you to DJ at the Haçienda. And that was how it happened. You know what I mean? That's the story of that. And I thought the Haçienda was going to be like a lot of the clubs that were in Manchester at the time, like small, dingy, you know, a couple of hundred people. And then when I went in there and saw this thing, it just blew my head completely. It was amazing. It was really amazing.
Apart from the sound system.
Apart from the sound system. And all the staff in there, I knew them because they all lived on John Nash Crescent where I lived as well.
I mean, the Crescents that Ewan's talking about in Manchester and Hume, you know, it was just a absolute creative hub, and probably a lot to do with what Manchester was about in the 80s, because there was a large black population in Hume, but there was also all these students and musicians and coming in, and there was a cross-pollination of ideas that was unique to Manchester in that respect.
The thing with Factory, at the time, there used to be a club in Hume that we called the PSV Club. PSV was the public service vehicle, it was the bus. But it was all the black workers that worked on the buses. That was like their social club. And Factory had a night in there, and it was punk, and it was... Everything was painted black. You couldn't see anything, it was just painted black. And it was one of those places where, you know, the band will be on stage and people will be gobbing on them and that sort of stuff and thingy. And they ran that night for quite a long time. And so when the Haçienda opened, all of these people turned up in the Haçienda. And so I'm in the DJ box and I'm thinking, what am I going to pay for these people? I'm a soul and funk DJ. I'm playing music that's bouncing off the wall all over the place, and they're all looking at me like, we're not into this. So I had to kind of like play stuff that I wouldn't normally play, you know, like Thompson Twins and Heaven 17 and Ryuki Sakamoto Riot in Lagos. And
which was a good track, though, yeah.
Yeah, so, it was a difficult time, but it was fun. It was really good fun. I kind of really enjoyed it.
Yeah, I mean,
Saturdays worked really well. Saturday was packed. And as you get further out of Saturday, it became emptier. Friday was a bit packed. Thursday was half packed, very quiet. Wednesday, they did some really good things. I remember they turned the dance floor in the Haçienda into a ship. And they had some actors came in. And they took the crowd through the ship, and they kind of like told a story about that. Things like that was really, really interesting, you know what I mean? I remember, I think my favourite one was William Burroughs. I'd never heard of him. But, you know, I knew he was some kind of god to literary people, but I'd never heard of him. So I'm like, okay, I want to hear what this guy plays. So normally when the bands come in, you know, you see the equipment set out on the stage. All they had for William Burroughs was a table and a chair and a microphone. So what's he going to do? Is he going to play his guitar or something? He just sat there and read from the book. And everybody in the club was really, really into it. And it kind of like, it blew my mind. I'd never seen anything like that before. There was dead silence in the club. Nobody spoke a word while he read from this book. And they did things like that. Some of them worked, some of them didn't, you know. But you just had to be there at the time. For a lot of people who were not there and they hear the negative side of it, there was a positive side for the Haçienda, definitely, yeah.
Were you two on the same kind of circuit? We were talking earlier, and, you know, there was a real soul, funk, northern soul scene like what Wigan, Birmingham, London. So you guys were on a, was it like a circuit, as it were?
Yeah, it was a circuit. People get bored going to the same club week in, week out. So the crowd would move around, you know. And then once a month we'd meet and we'd have an all-dayer somewhere at the Ritz or something like that. But all the different clubs, all the different DJs visited, and the crowd moved around and, you know, meet other people. People from Birmingham went to Wigan and met Wigan people, that sort of stuff. It was.
I just wanted to point out the separation between Northern Soul and the side of the scene that we were on, which was all contemporary black music, the latest American. So the Northern Soul scene was a separate scene. If you go back historically, Northern Soul is primarily a scene of majority white kids who are passionate about black music. There is a small black representation in the Northern Soul scene, but it is a small representation. The side of the scene we're talking about is on the black side, that people didn't go for Northern Soul because for them it was their parents' music, if you get what I mean. That this was the music, not necessarily the same tracks, but the vibe of music their parents were playing in the 60s at parties and stuff. So the black kids were always looking towards what's next, where's the future, where's it moving to? And that was where we were. So it was all about being up front. Your music you had to be ahead of everybody else to be at that top table and get the all-dayer bookings. This is where you first heard these records coming out of, in the early 80s, primarily New York, and then, you know, like taking off here, you know, on this underground, and then some of those tracks had span out to other DJs. Some of them had even become hits later down the line after they got a UK release. But, you know, that was the nature of the scene, to be up front. You know, you didn't play a record for 3, 4, 5 months. You got a couple of months out of a record, and you'd moved it on and gone to the next lot and everything.
Was there competition between the DJs in bookings?
Competition between? Not really, because
really.
it was like we all saw each other's values. Different people did different things. So Colleen Curtis, of course, had come from the Northern Soul scene. He was a famous DJ before all this at Blackpool Mecca with Ian Levine. And they caused the schism in Northern Soul, which was that they started to play contemporary records alongside the 60s rarities. So the Casino in Wigan, it was all about that kind of mid-60s Motown-esque sound, and they were still mining for all these small label releases.
Yeah.
Whereas the Mecca had moved on and was now embracing what was the basis of what they call modern soul now, but also New York disco. In this, you know, Ian Levine got into the New York clubs and everything, and Curtis was into like this new emerging jazz funk sound. Gil Scott-Heron, Roy Ayers, these people, and it just moved. And eventually, out of that, Levine goes in one direction and will become the main DJ on the gay scene in the country. He was a resident at Heaven in London, which opened in 1979. Curtis would then move into like this jazz funk side. That took him to Manchester, where he hooked up with John Grant, and they had Rafters, the famous club there. Yeah. And so, you know, Colleen Curtis was a very well-revered, respected DJ at this point. A lot of people I mean, from my own personal perspective, because I was from Liverpool, and it wasn't so connected with the Northern Soul connection back in the day. The DJs I kind of grew up with were people like Les Spain and Terry Linane. So I didn't have quite that reverence that some of the DJs already had in that respect. But you knew Colin with jazz. He was so obsessive about, and he brought this Northern Soul type, forensic to music. And Hewan, I knew Hewan was a really strong jazz DJ, you know, and other DJs specialised in slightly different areas. John Grant was more of a showman. He had the pyrotechnics and everything. So everybody was coming from the different direction. Once you got to that level, you couldn't have, you know, DJs aren't the same. they all have their own personality, and that's what the meld was of bringing those people together as an all-day team, you know, to do these events.
There was also this thing of, I don't know.
Ooh.
There's a man in here that stood over there. Ross, come here. Come here, Ross. This man here, unknown, I've always wanted to big this guy up. Because he was kind of like at the center of all of this, because he worked in the record shop. Every Saturday we go down to his record shop. Well, it wasn't his shop, but he worked there. And he would dish out the records to the DJs. And there was a kind of hierarchy. Whosoever was playing to the largest audience or did the most club, say 2 copies of a track come in, that DJ would get it first. Was that true?
Yeah, that's right.
Am I right? Am I right?
Totally,
Yeah, that's right. So people...
The guys with the most influence, they got the records.
Yeah, the guys with the most influence got the record first. So people like Colleen Curtis, Mike Schaff,
Mike, 'cause he had the radio.
Mike had the radio station. Mike had reach with the radio station. And of course, you know, Mike playing a track on the radio would encourage people to go down to the record shop and buy it off him. So Mike would get the track first. Colin, who didn't do a radio station, he did the club. He might get it second. I was about 20 down the line. So I'd have to wait weeks. I'd have to hear people like Mike play it on the radio show, hear Colin play it in the club, and then I'd put in an order off Russ and get it off him. But this man here, he was kind of like central to what we're talking about now. He's very, I love him.
Hello. Hello. We have microphone issues. Yeah, I mean, Spinning, it was a shop in Manchester on Cross Street initially. And it was run by a guy called Gary Lane. And this goes back into like a lot of the things I talk about in the book about in the 60s, the import channels opening, that DJs like Guy Stevens at the Scene in London, and also Roger Eagle at the Twisted Wheel in Manchester were like wanting to buy the records direct from America, so they were right into like Chicago labels and New York labels and stuff, and those channels were opening up, and eventually Gary opened Spinning as a shop in, and it was only a really small place that on a Saturday, you know, like enough to squeeze about 15 people in. And then outside, it'd just be packed with people who were listening and seeing what was, and if they were lucky, there might be a few copies of the track they liked that was left. But it was the only place to go. If you wanted to be a part of this scene, you had to shop at Spinning or go to, there was a few shops in London, but, you know, there was no other option. I mean, other shops might have sold imports, but they were buying their imports from Spinning, you know, so it was a second degree thing. And so, like, you know, Spinning was the hub of the scene in terms of this is where the music is coming in. Like Hewan said, if Mike Schaff plays the record on the radio, or if later Stu Allen plays the record on the radio, it means that people are going to be coming in the shop and buying copies of it. You know, if it's gone big on the all-day scene or in certain clubs, people are in the shop, and that's how it works. You know, and why you would like have that hierarchy working within that. And you know, I mean, I there's a story like in Spinning when I met Kev, though, you know, way back then. And there's a record. This is before it had blown up at Legend, and you know, I had this kind of power base on the scene, so to speak. But at this point, it was a little bit before that. And I remember Arthur Adams, You Got the Floor, and the first I heard of that record was somebody came into Legend on a Wednesday. We were still building Legend then. We were still struggling to get numbers in. And the main event was on the Tuesday with Colin and, well, John Grant before that, and Mike Schaff,
Mike
Blues and
Schaff.
Soul, Piccadilly Radio promoted, had all the weight behind it. So somebody comes up to me on Wednesday night, Arthur Adams, you got the floor. Sorry, mate, I haven't heard of it. Okay, it was the big track at the main event last night. He played about 3 times. Okay, and so I'm on the phone. Arthur Adams, oh yeah, it's been in, we've got make sure I have a copy, save a copy for me. The next week, I went in that hasn't come in yet. And I have to go back in again to Legend the second week with the biggest record that's being played on the scene, and I haven't got a copy, which is really embarrassing from my perspective. And so I that night, like somebody comes up, Arthur Adams, sorry, I haven't got it, and it's this. Then this kid comes in and says, Arthur Adams, you got the floor? And I said, no, I haven't got it. He says, I've got a copy in the car. I got it the other day. I was like, so I said, yeah, get it in. So at least I played it, so thank God. But the next day or a few days later, I went straight to Gary. And at the time, I was the resident at Wigan Pier as well. I did 4 nights a week. The Pier bought records too. I bought records. So we were one of Spinning's top customers on a weekly basis, spending well over 100, sometimes nudging 150, 200.
The clubs used to have their own records.
A lot of clubs did buy their own records back then. So I just said to Gary, look, it can't happen. I can't be in a position where I haven't got the biggest new record in. So either we sort something out or I'm going to have to start shopping in London. And he said, we'll sort it out for you. And never had that situation again. But that was, me coming up the pecking order and maybe being kind of kept down in my place a little bit. But 6 months later, it was a different scenario because the electro, that side of the scene had come in. The audience within the club responded massively to that. Although I did take a lot of criticism from the soul purists, as for playing this music, Planet Rock, it's Kraftwerk, and we were talking about Buffalo Gals before, Malcolm McLaren. When I got that, I knew I was going to play it, but it was like, I'm going to get so much stick for playing Malcolm McLaren, in a black music club. But that was the way it was. There was a reluctance for change, and it was the same that happened in Northern Soul days with the schism there. A reluctance to change, but things have to change and have to move on.
There's always that period when what people term a new genre comes into being, where you try and fit it into the line that you're running at the time. I remember when electro came in and Greg used to play it. Previously we used to listen to soul tracks, and then Greg started playing the electro stuff. And then the dance floor was taken over by young boys that were doing all these kind of moves and all this stuff. And yeah, he did get a bit of stick for that. And then it became massive, it became part of the mainstream. And then it got forgotten about as it embeds into the mainstream. And it's the same with house music. When house music started coming in, I remember Colin was the first person I heard with that, and it was a track called Jack My Dick. You remember it?
I've got at home, I used to record Mike Shaft every week before I worked at Spinning, and I went through all my cassettes and found the first time he'd played a house record on the radio in Manchester. It was
Can you date that, yeah?
Yeah, 1985, James. Silk Music is the Key. That's the first house record, official house record.
And then at the time, you're saying, we didn't know this was house. It was
it was just a transition.
It was another kind of electro. It was all within that kind of package from.
It was actually called garage first because it was being played in Paradise Garage. So that was the term of it, and then it became house, and then we had the job of kind of like integrating it into the soul and the funk and the electro. What we were playing, it was really difficult. I was lucky because I had a group of people called Foot Patrol, who were really into it, and they would get on the floor whenever I used to play house music, and they would dance, and people would look at them and think, oh, okay, that's the way you dance to it, and that's how it worked for me. And I mean, you ended up with Foot Patrol.
No, Broken Glass.
No, yeah, Broken Glass with a hip hop group.
Yeah. Foot Patrol were like originally they were jazz dancers. They were fusion dancers. So and they adapted a fusion jazz dancing style to house music. So it's a lot closer to that kind of foot shuffle vibe that you see now. They call it shuffling. So and they were the people that initially at the Playpen, where Colin and yourself and Mike Schaff played. These records started to be played into it, and they were the people that would have brought this into the Haçienda in the first instance. You know, them and their contemporaries. Gerald being another Gerald Simpson, a guy called Gerald, again a dancer, again coming from a jazz background, and again embracing the new musics that are emerging and coming. You know, I often say with Gerald's a good example that where people don't realise what went on before. There was an assumption, or there is an assumption still with some people, that a guy called Gerald goes into the Haçienda, hears this house music from Chicago, has an epiphany, goes away, makes Voodoo Ray, and that's history. The truth is, a guy called Gerald and his contemporaries brought the music into the Haçienda in the first place. They were the ones. So Mike Pickering himself will say that some kid came up to him, some black kid from Moss Side, with a copy of Adonis, No Way Back. And that was where it kind of started with the Haçienda and what they were doing on their Friday nights.
And can I just say, those black kids, they used to come down to my night on a Saturday in a club called The Gallery, where I used to play that. And what I used to do with the house music, in order to get it into people's consciousness, I had an agreement with the manager of the club. Whenever I played the tune, he switched the lights out, and the whole place was black. And then you were there one time when we did it, didn't you?
This is called
So the Gallery, we were really kind of up front because of Russ. I mean, Russ gave me these records, and I took them into the club, and I played them, and the kids heard them, and then went to the Haçienda and say, you know, why are you not playing this type of music? So there's a lineage that's there.
Well, I think what's interesting about the book is that it does tie all these things together.
Yes.
That, you there's a learned kind of history, and actually you look under the bonnet, and it is there's so much more to it. And the way all these scenes link up to each other, and
it's like a web.
And you say it doesn't just land; it's like it's really interesting the way each scene informs the next. It's this evolution.
Yeah, it's a web. You know, the whole thing is a web. You know, that interconnects, and different people come in from different places and different angles. You know, one of the pieces in the book is a Manchester club called the Reno, and this again, you know, Hewan, although he played the Haçienda, a lot of people in Manchester will also remember him from his time at the Reno, and also what the Reno represented to Manchester. It was a different kind of club. It was right in, you know, the front line of Moss Side within the black community. This was, you know, Legend was very much a black club in terms of the fact that the majority audience was black kids, but this was within a black area, run by black people. And so tell us about the Reno, because it's great to have been able to, what I'm saying is it's trying to thread this all together. There were places like the Reno in a lot of different cities in the UK where there were black communities that haven't been documented, but now we know a bit more about the Reno, so we can kind of talk about it.
Basically what happened is that it was really difficult for black people to get into the clubs in the town centre, because we like to dance and get sweaty, and so we don't drink, and so the club doesn't make any money on the bar. So there was always that's where that stems from. There's a bar, don't let black people in, they'll fill the club up, they'll sweat the whole place up, and they'll go in the toilet and drink water under the taps. They won't buy anything on the bar. So that became a really big thing. So, you know, we had to find our own places. Within the black community, there are things that you might know, they're called shebeens. Shebeens are like somebody who's got a big basement in his house. He'd put a sound system in, play some music, and people will come in. They don't pay. They buy drinks off the bar, and it's free. The Reno comes out of that. Now the Reno is gone, I can tell you a story. I remember going in very early, at 11 o'clock when it opened, and me and the owner of the club, I was sat in the DJ box and he was behind the bar setting the drinks out. And this fat white guy came in and went on the bar and leant on the bar. And the owner of the club gave him a pint. And then he pushed an envelope over to him. And then he drank his drink, picked the envelope, put it in his back pocket and disappeared. And he was a policeman. He was a copper, so he was getting payola from the club. The reason the club was able to open till like 6 in the morning was because he had to give a backhander to the local police that were based in Moss Side Police Station around the corner. I was kind of like shocked seeing that. But that's definitely how the Reno survived. Every now and again it'll get raided. About 20 police officers will come in and then they'd run into the corner of the club and grab somebody out and take them out because they knew everybody was in there. You know what I mean? It was an amazing place because, for one thing, you could smoke weed. And for me, it would never smoked weed before in my life. It was kind of like amazing going into that place. I got high just breathing the atmosphere. You know what I mean? And as you all know, whenever you smoke weed, black music sounds brilliant. I don't know why that is. But you know yourself, you've all been there, you know all that little token stuff. So the Reno, we were able to expand our playlist in the Reno, whereas most of the clubs in town were playing like 12 inches or the main track off an album. We were able to play the more obscure stuff that, you know, that wouldn't touch in the town clubs and stuff like that. You know, we'd play stuff like Warren L. Jones, It Must Have Been Love That Brought Us Together. Just, it's a beautiful tune. So yeah, the Reno was, for me as a DJ, it was the best place I've ever played. Because I could play whatever I wanted.
How was the sound system?
The sound system was just, it was shite. It was shite, but you could get the feeling of what was coming out of the groove of the records on it. You know what I mean? A lot of the time, I got on the mic and said, I wish the manager would buy some new speakers or something like that. And we had the decks was an old twin deck. I can't remember the name of it. Rubber drive thing. There was no vary speed or anything. So mixing was virtually impossible. But it was a place where the audience that was coming in knew what the DJ was going to play, and the DJ kind of like knew what the audience expected of them. And so that to me was my perfect nightclub, you know. And we had this thing of rewind. When you play a tune that they all loved, they'd all be banging their glasses on the table and somebody would go, "Start that tune again! Rewind!" You had to rewind it and start the tune all over again, you know. Some of the big tunes, you'd rewind them about 3 times, you know. The Reno was amazing. It was really, everybody was in there. People from stage and TV were in there. I remember Alex Higgins in there when Alex was going through his bad times. Alex used to, in the back room we had a snooker table which doubled as a gambling table as well. And Alex used to go in and they used to place bets on whether they could beat him. Alex got pissed and wiped them all. He was really, really good. And I remember Alex having a conversation with me when he was totally slashed. And he said, what was he saying? He said he wanted to come and live with the black people because the white folks didn't like him and all that kind of stuff. He was going through a really bad time, as you all know. He was going through that really bad time. He was always in there. I remember Tony, there was a lot of criminals in there. There was a lot of criminals in there. There were a lot of prostitutes in there. But they all got drunk and they all got high and everybody just got on. And I remember Tony Wilson, Rob Gretton, Alan Erasmus, Mike Pickering, and a couple of others. Tony had his stag party in the Reno. And he stood in the middle of the club taking photographs, and behind him all the crumbos are like this. They fucking down. I know Ollie Wilson, Tony Wilson's son, and I said to him, can you find those photographs, please? Because they'd be worth like millions of pounds, but he's not found them yet. But that was the thing with the Reno. At 2 o'clock when town finishes, the Renos just get packed. Everybody just comes straight into the Reno, and it got packed, tight, hot, sticky, sweaty, but it was brilliant.
I'm just conscious of time ticking on, so maybe we put some questions to the floor. Who's got a question?
I've got a question.
Thank you.
Hiya. I'm Dave from Bradford, by the way. Just so when all this were going on, and obviously there's all this underground music from America, and you're working in a record shop, or you run a record shop, it was a connection sort of thing that brought this music across, or was there not a connection, or how did it kind of happen?
You mean in the first instance?
Yeah.
Well, what I was saying before about certain DJs opening import channels, so it wasn't enough for them just to play what was being released in the UK, that they wanted latest American records. It could take some time back in the 60s and 50s and stuff for an American release to be out here. So it was about getting the music quicker. And these DJs then, by opening these channels, by people like Gary Lane that we were saying before, opening shops or mail order in the initial side maybe, bit by bit kind of provided the infrastructure for this scene that also worked with the radio shows, specialist shows like Mike Shaft once a week, Terry Linane in Liverpool once a week, Richard Serling, Hallam once a week. You know, we didn't get much airtime, but those once a week times were like really important, and people, you know, tuned in. And the third aspect of that was the magazines. So Blues and Soul was the main magazine that linked the whole scene, that people advertised in, that was written about, that there were DJ charts in, that you could see what was happening in America. You know, other side things, but important, James Hamilton's Record Mirror column, which he did weekly, listing all, mainly the UK releases. So, you know, from our side, it was like where we were at the time. I mean, I used to get, you know, from when I was 16, 17, I got on all the record company mailing lists. There was a book called Emperor Roscoe's DJ book, and it said in it that DJs could get free records from the record companies. And I was like, dude, it did sound good. I was like, I want a bit of that. And then at the back, he put all the addresses and phone numbers of the record companies. So I was able to ring them and get on the lists. And so by the time I was kind of 17 and stuff, I was getting everything, Warner Brothers, RCA, CBS, the lot. So everything worthwhile being released in the UK, I was getting for free before it was even out in the UK, which was amazing. But that was still, the step was to import. So it freed me up to buy more imports and bring more imports into play. But when we move into this scene that we're talking about with Hewan in the early 80s and stuff, when we were both on the All Dayers, it was all imports. You couldn't wait for a UK release. It was been and gone a lot of the time by that, the way that happened, you know. And I saw DJs on the radio go by the wayside because initially it was all about the imports. They were going to spinning every week, getting the imports, playing it. They were right up to date. And bit by bit they dropped off that and just started relying on the UK promos. And it was plain to see for anyone who was deep into the scene, you know, that wasn't enough. You had to have what was directly coming out of the States that week, if possible, you know.
It's interesting you saying that, because recently I found out that when the record companies release music in America, the first place it went was Germany, and then it'd go to London, and then if there was any left, it'd come to Manchester. That was right, wasn't it?
Maybe, I don't know. I'm not too sure. Spinning used to order their own records direct from America.
Okay.
So you get like.
Yeah, the way I saw it, Spin was just different.
Yeah.
The things had come in, and you know, I go to London now and again to shop and find different bits. but they wouldn't have known about other tracks that was, you know, coming into Manchester.
We did use there was a big distributor in London called Greyhound Records who used to bring massive amounts of stuff in from the States and then ship it out to shops around the UK. So we used them, but also used our own distributors in America. They came over by flight and pick them up from Piccadilly. They were red starred up from Heathrow on a Saturday. Had to go and get them, open the box. That's how it worked.
The reason I said that is because I know a DJ that worked in Germany who used to work in the Reno. His name was Kenny B. And Kenny B got a house in Germany. And it's, can I swear? Fucking amazing. He had millions of CDs. You walk through the front door, CDs up the wall, CDs down there, CDs in the cellar. It stopped in the bathroom. But and I went to his collection, and there were CDs there that I'd never seen, that I'd never seen even come to, you know, spinning or through London. And I asked him where he got them from, and he explained to me that was how it worked from America. Germany would get them first, because there were a lot of black servicemen in Germany who was into the music really well. So I was quite shocked by that, seriously.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
5 minutes.
Any other questions? Who's got a question?
Last question.
There's got to be
wanna
some
dance.
other question.
We want to dance.
I have a question for everyone. Really, I was just wondering about, you mentioned about the practice of nightclubs buying records, and I was wondering, like, you know, who in the nightclub had the task of buying the records, and, you know, because presumably they'd be choosing what to buy. Did they go to a record shop and then the record shop would say, oh, this is what you need? Or, you know, and so who was in charge of that? And were DJs ever kind of funny about playing the nightclub's records or not? And then what happened to all those collections?
Can I just say, there was another club in Manchester that I used to work in that was called Pips. I used to work in Pips in the early 80s. I used to work in the soul room. And Pips had about 5 different rooms. There was a soul room, there was a kind of like Roxy, Bowie room, there was a heavy rock room, and there was a pop room at the back and stuff like that. And there was a guy that was employed by the club, and his job was to go out and buy music for all the different rooms. And so what you'd do is the DJ would go into Pips, walk into the office, and pick up a box of records that were designated for that room. So I'd go in and pick up the soul box and play all the stuff that was in it. And one of the things I did was I was kind of like the backup DJ. If ever somebody didn't turn up for their respective room, I had to go in the room and just play what was in the box. And I remember playing in the Bowie room, because the Bowie DJ, he'd had an epileptic fit and he couldn't come in. And so I went in the office, picked it up, and there's all Bauhaus, all this. Oh my God, it was horrible stuff. But I just picked it up, put it on, played it, and we were all like dancing to it and stuff like that. And I actually got into Kraftwerk because of that. I love Kraftwerk. I love their music. You know what I mean? So yeah, there was somebody that was employed by the club to kind of like fill all the music for the different rooms.
I mean, when we were at Wigan Pier, they give it to the DJs, you know, which was great because I could do, you know, the risk tracks. Should I really be buying this? I could put it in their pile. Because, I mean, I still bought my own records at the same time. I mean, the whole principle of it was why the clubs did it in the first place is that the DJs were interchangeable. When I started DJing, DJs were 10 a penny, they said. You know, you could put a trained monkey up there and do that job. It's just playing records. You know, there was really, in a club level, the management, you know, DJs weren't on anything like the pedestal that they later became. Yeah, so, I mean, I got my first club night because of a club that it bought records. I had a mobile disco when I was 15, and we were doing a wedding upstairs at a place called the Chelsea Reach in New Brighton, and downstairs they had a normal night, and it was a really good place locally, and their DJ hadn't turned up, and they came, can one of you do it? And I was able to do it because they had their own records there. So I left the other guy upstairs doing the wedding. I came down, and I got the job on the back of that, and that was my start in DJing. And that was like down to them having their own records in many respects.
Well, I think that's going to be it. Thank you very much to Gray and Ewan. Fascinating. I feel like we could have gone on for another hour or two. Really recommend this. Gregory Sonium round the corner.
Yeah, if you want to get a copy of the book and if you want it signed, happy to do that. We're just going to set it up here and I'll be here while Ewan's playing and I'll DJ a bit later. See you later then.